Well, hello and welcome back to Critical Weight Theory. And if you've never listened to this before, well, where the heck were you? But I'm glad you're here now anyway. So, in this episode, I'm getting into something that sounds simple on the surface, but turns out to be surprisingly complicated once you look closer. I'm talking about folklore, fairy tales, the stories that people pass down. Now, I've done numerous episodes about fairy tales already, and it's a bit silly because, they're not my most popular episodes or anything like that. But I like the topic, so I kind of occasionally return to it. I don't really chase after what's popular or what's going to get me the most clicks or listens or whatever. I just focus on stuff that I'm kind of interested in. So in this specific episode, I'm going to specifically look at the idea that these stories came from some kind of pure, untouched oral tradition or some variation on that sort of claim, because that idea doesn't really hold up anymore. It's sort of like representing an old model. We've got newer, updated models of thinking about this. But for a long time, scholars imagined that folklore looked like this. You had ordinary people, peasants, villagers, whatever you want to call them, Joe Schmo, Joe Six Pack. Anyway, they were passing stories down by word of mouth. And these stories were seen as pure, shaped by, tradition. Then something else happens somewhere along the line. Writing shows up. You've got books, educated elites, and suddenly the stories get corrupted. You're just turning them into garbage, making them into a, I guess, corrupted form. And, it's a clean, simple binary. Oral tradition equals authentic, literary equals contaminated, icky, throw it away. But that's exactly the problem. It's too clean, and modern scholarship has pushed back hard on this, actually. And, funny enough, I'm going to get into an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000, also known as MST3K, and it's actually one of my favorite episodes. It's a fan favorite, but it actually deals with some of these sort of fairy tale sort of characters. And instead of a one way street from oral to written, we now see something more like a loop or something like that. It's more complicated. Stories actually move in both directions. Take collectors like Brothers Grimm. They're often imagined as wandering through the countryside, writing down tales from isolated peasants, but in reality, many of their sources were not isolated at all. Some were actually educated middle class people. One well known example involves the daughters of a local pharmacist, women who already knew literary versions of the stories. In fact, the Brothers Grimm primarily collected their famous fairy tales from educated, middle class acquaintances. Boy, I struggle with that word, acquaintances, in urban areas, rather than directly from peasants in the countryside, as they often claimed. So, apparently they may have kind of spread that myth about themselves. And one of the most significant examples is Henriette Dorothea Dorchen Wilde, the daughter of a local pharmacist. And as far as that background goes, I don't have all the details, but Dorchen apparently was a childhood friend and neighbor of the Grimm brothers, so that's pretty convenient. But her contribution, did I say contribution? Contribution. She and her family, including her mother and sisters, provided many famous tales, such as Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, and all kinds of fur, which is one I don't know if I've ever heard of even. But anyway, there was some literary familiarity in that. They were educated middle class women, and Dorchen and her circle were already familiar with these literary versions of the stories. And Apparently, Wilhelm Grimm actually married Dorchen in 1825. And there are other notable sources who were educated, including the Hassenpflug family, who were also friends of the Grimms, with several sisters. There's Marie, Jeanette, and Amalie, and they were sharing stories too, apparently. And the Grimms often edited these oral accounts, blending them with literary sources. So, these weren't just all coming from, random people out in the countryside or whatever. They actually had connections with some of these people. So what the Grimms recorded wasn't just some untouched oral tradition, it was already shaped by books, by culture, and by exchange. So it's also worth noting that the folk are not passive in all this. Another big shift in thinking is that we now recognize that people were not just passively receiving stories or whatever, they were actively reshaping them. And that's kind of an important thing to make note of, because if you're really looking for a pure form, I mean, how do you even find that if these stories have constant variations in their retellings? There kind of is no pure form if you really think about it that way. So a tale might actually appear in print, get picked up by a storyteller, like their version of a folk singer or something like that, and they'd be retold, changed, readapted in certain ways, and passed along again and again. And that means the so-called folk were not just preserving tradition; they were constantly remixing it. Like tracks get remixed and mashed up in YouTube videos or something like that. And a story like John the Bear, for example, does not exist in one fixed form. It shows up in multiple versions, each shaped by the people telling it. So, interestingly enough, John the Bear, often known as Juan Oso in Spanish, is a classic example of a bear's son tale, which exists in countless fluid variations rather than one fixed text. And the version that I'm most familiar with, yes, I'm getting to it. This is the Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode featuring the Russian film Jack Frost. And this was episode 813. It's an all time classic. Some people say it's the best episode of MST3K overall. And the riffs are great throughout the episode, and riffs is another word for jokes because they're regularly making fun of the movie basically. And it's just a great episode even if you don't watch it with the MST3K folks involved. It's still a fun story and a fun movie. But anyway, they have as a moment in the movie some John the Bear elements, and it kind of links to the story of the protagonist, or one of the protagonists, Ivan, who is based on the Russian folk figure Ivan the Bear's son, or Ivan, maybe if you want to stick to the Americanized pronunciation. And the movie mashes this tale with the Morozko or Father Frost story. And what are some key moments of the John the Bear storyline? Well, there's a transformation aspect. Yvonne, who is a vain and narcissistic hero, is cursed by a magical mushroom man for his arrogance. As he attempts to shoot a mother bear, the mushroom man transforms his head into that of a bear. And there's also a moment where Crow T Robot, he appears. It's one of the host segments, and takes the he like transforms into a bear basically, and he takes the simulation to the extreme by actually turning into the bear. And the transformation scene is it includes one of the episode's most famous lines. And there's also Mike's observation about Yvonne's goofy bear-like appearance, and The bots also frequently mock what they call the mincing little fungus or the mushroom man. And basically that little mushroom man, I mean he's cute, he's fun, lovable and all that, but he's also sort of an annoying little a-hole character. And it's a great moment in MST3K history. And there's also, getting back to the Yvonne story, to break the curse, Yvonne must learn humility and perform a selfless act, which he eventually does by helping an old woman or something like that. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not remembering perfectly exactly how the curse is resolved. It's a strange story, but it's actually part of the, it's basically a fairy tale story, and there are all sorts of variations that are shaped by cultural context. And you also have variations based on the teller and the audience. And it shows you how these oral traditions evolve. You've got the Ursine or Ursine genealogy and origin aspect. In most versions, John is the son of a human woman and a bear, inheriting immense strength and often a fur covered back. And in some stories, there's a bear-like nature that is simply a metaphor for his raw power, and in others he is purely human but raised by a bear or something like that. Kind of reminds me of the boy who is raised by wolves, and apparently there are genuine examples of that actually happening. A child who grew up among wolves. So um, I might do an episode on that at some point because it's definitely an interesting topic, feral children or whatever. And as the story travels, John's companions who help him rescue princesses from an underworld or mountain, they change based on local folklore. They're often defined by extreme abilities, uh, such as having an iron knee. I guess tree puller is a part of it, or mountain crusher. Just feats of strength or something like that, sort of like Hercules, I guess. And there's an admixture with other tales. John the Bear frequently merges with other types that focus on tests of strength or that emphasize magical helpers. And I guess maybe that little mushroom, that mincing little fungus guy in the MST3K episode is sort of a magical helper character in a way. And often, there are European versions or adaptations that highlight the bear's connection to regional pagan traditions and animist beliefs, particularly, you know, when it comes to these certain regions, I guess. And in Latin America, Juan Oso tales are widespread. I might be mispronouncing that. But anyway, they incorporate local cultural elements and they're often mixed with other traditions as well. And in uh, the North American uh, influence, there's the European bear's suntail has been adopted into, you know, uh, different traditions. Like uh, you can probably find them like maybe the werewolf concept is similar to this, although of course werewolves are considered more malicious and stuff like that. And you also have some Native American oral traditions where the bear is revered, and it kind of, it's kind of different but kind of the same, and there's also fluidity in performance because it's an oral tale, so each storyteller can shape the narrative, sometimes focusing on the comedy of the unnatural elements of the story and the drama of the battles or something like that. It can be different all over the place, and the story is really not a rigid text, but a living tradition that uses these same structural bones. You got a bear, a strong son, maybe some stolen princesses thrown into the mix, and betrayal by companions, or magical helpers, and you got all these things to tell different stories. And folklorists can have a field day specializing in examining certain aspects of an individual retelling of the story. And this leads to one of the biggest changes in modern folklore studies, the idea of a single or original version, a kind of ur text, as they're sometimes called in the field. But anyway, that has mostly been abandoned because, it's just an outdated premise. And older methods tried to trace every story back to its first pure form, but now scholars see that as a dead end. There isn't one original, there are just many variations, all existing at once. And you've got oral versions, written versions, now even film and digital versions, and all that kind of stuff. So they all influence each other, at and public perception. So, what should we focus on then? If we're not chasing the original, what are we doing instead? Um, it's more about meaning and function and context. What does a story do in a particular time and place? Why does it change? Who's telling it and why? And that approach treats fairy tales as these living things instead of just being like boring old relics. So there's a broader perspective here too. There's a useful way to think about this that's actually, I'm going to name drop here because I'm doing a quote from Confucius. Anyway, Confucius once said that studying alone without peers leads to limited knowledge and narrow perspectives. And that's an idea that really applies here. When we isolate folklore and treat it as something sealed off from literature, broader culture, or history, we miss what's actually happening. Stories don't live in isolation, they move through people, through media, and through time in general. This isn't just about fairy tales, of course. You could apply this sort of understanding to just culture in general. In general, that's how things work. There's always been a fear, sometimes justified, that powerful groups shape narratives for their own benefit. And you can see that happening with variations of these tales as well. You see it in politics too. There's a continuing concern about corporations influencing politicians in the search for contracts and greater benefit. So stories like power and powerful interests are never neutral. And going into the politics of it, like there is a political aspect to a company like Disney taking these fairy tales, these folk tales, if you will, and just commercializing them and having all their own, like basically taking these ideas and treating them as if they were all just Disney originals. You know what I mean? There's there's something I've long criticized Disney for, and that is a major part of it. They take these old tales and they treat them as if they're Disney originals, and I'm just not a huge fan of that. You know, it's not that I hate everything that Disney puts out. In fact, because Disney is basically swallowing up so many different businesses and taking over so much of culture, it's harder to find stuff that is not in some way connected with Disney, because so much of culture is actually like a business. And that's one of the dangers of trying to just simple-mindedly condemn Disney overall, because if you condemn Disney overall, you're kind of missing out on the fact that Disney probably owns some quality content, and that would include some of these fairy tale things. Like there's actually a pretty decent, I forget the name of it, but I'm probably going to review it at some point. But there's a pretty decent fairy tale themed movie that Disney put out. It's a musical, and I actually enjoyed it, even though I fell asleep during part of it, and I'll probably have to rewatch it. But I'm not a big musical fan, even overall. But sometimes if a musical is done well, I can appreciate it. So it's not like I hate that damn Mickey Mouse everywhere he sets his cultural trap out for us. It's a mixed bag. But these stories are shaped by who tells them and who sells them. You know what I mean? And sometimes, yeah, people make things up and present them as truth. That's not new. It's part of the cultural system. And we have to, in this modern era, really struggle extra hard to decide what is true and what is not. Basically what is real and what is a fairy tale. Because the lines between fact and fiction are increasingly blurring. So, that's always been the I was going to say the trace as mixing the word the truth and the fact. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that when you look at culture, some things that we now consider fantastical were actually things that people believed in the past, like vampires, for example, and werewolves. And some people still believe in demons and whatnot. Some people still believe in witches that can cast crazy magical spells. So, we might consider things like fairy tales um, and dismiss them as such. But you have to really remember that some of these magical things are things that people actually believed. So there's that whole aspect of it too, which is kind of crazy to think about because people still believe in demons. They still believe in God and the devil and heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff, which to my atheistic brain registers as being no different that much from a fairy tale, but some people view those things as being absolutely true. So, where does all that leave us? Instead of thinking about folklore as something old and fixed, it's better to think of it as something that's fluid, something free in a way, how it's changing, how it's being reshaped. It's not pure, it's not totally corrupted, it's just alive. Well, I've done plenty of yapping on this topic. I definitely fumbled on a few parts while I was speaking, but this is raw. It's not polished. I don't go that far out of my way to edit stuff most of the time. But if you did enjoy any of this content, about storytelling and how it's been, you know, changing in you know the ages of humankind and including film and online, feel free to subscribe to this podcast, like this episode, especially if you see it on YouTube or something. And yeah, give me other suggestions for topics if you want. Make a comment in the comment section if there is one. And just thanks for listening. Have a good one.